It was one of those rare spring mornings in the village of St. Mary Mead, when the air felt sharper, fresher, and quite intent on reminding everyone that winter had only just receded. A pale sun glimmered across the tiled roofs and narrow lanes, striking a hesitant truce with the retreating mist that still lingered about the hedgerows. Sparrows busied themselves along the eaves of cottages, darting here and there with purposeful chirps, while the distant toll of the church bells summoned the more devout to morning prayers. Miss Jane Marple, seated primly at her parlour window, regarded the scene with the serene contentment of one who has lived long enough to appreciate both its beauty and its patterns. She had her knitting upon her lap, though truth be told, she had scarcely moved her needles in the last quarter of an hour. Her eyes, shrewd behind their spectacles, were far too occupied with watching the progress of Mrs. Price, Ridley parading down the lane with a new hat she clearly wished everyone to admire. St. Mary Mead, though tranquil in appearance, was rarely devoid of intrigue. Human nature being what it is, Miss Marple often reflected, one could observe more drama in a single afternoon of polite tea visits than in all the novels of sensation her nephew Raymond so heartily recommended. And, as was her peculiar gift, Miss Marple had developed the knack of discerning in such dramas the faint, unmistakable outlines of danger. On this particular morning, however, her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of her maid, young Gladys, who entered carrying a silver tray upon which sat the morning's post and a modest pot of tea. "2 letters for you, ma'am," Gladys announced, placing the tray upon the occasional table, with the air of one who considered correspondence a matter of great moment. "And Mrs. Bartlett from the High Street says the vicar's wife is calling a committee meeting for the flower show." "Ah, thank you, Gladys," Miss Marple replied with her usual mildness. "Do have a look whether the post includes anything from my nephew. He promised to send me a book on wildflowers." Gladys dutifully peered over the envelopes. "No, ma'am. One from Mrs. Bantry at Gossington Hall, and another with rather fine paper. Looks like it's from the Manor." Miss Marple raised her brows with interest. The Manor had lately acquired new residents, the Favershams, who had moved into the stately, but somewhat neglected property only a few months prior. Colonel Arthur Faversham, retired from the Indian Army, had settled there with his wife, Evelyn, a graceful woman whose smile concealed an air of melancholy. Along with them lived the Colonel's niece, a striking young lady named Margaret, known more commonly as Meg. The household had at once become a subject of speculation in St. Mary Mead, particularly because of their somewhat reclusive habits. Miss Marple reached for the Manor envelope and slit it open with care. The note within, written in a delicate, slanting hand, invited her to afternoon tea that very day. "Curious," murmured Miss Marple. "The Favershams are not much given to social overtures." Gladys, who delighted in the latest tidings, leaned forward. "Oh, do you suppose something's the matter, ma'am?" Miss Marple only smiled gently. "One should never suppose, Gladys. But it is generally the case that invitations conceal purpose." A gathering at the Manor that afternoon, Miss Marple arrived at Faversham Manor, her walking stick tapping softly along the gravel drive. The house, with its ivy-covered walls and slightly sagging roofline, bore the look of an aging aristocrat whose dignity outlived his fortune. The heavy oak door was opened by a maid, and Miss Marple was ushered into a drawing-room where tea had been set with silver service and delicate porcelain. Mrs. Evelyn Faversham rose to greet her guest, tall and elegant in a pale lilac gown. Her manner was gracious, though tinged with nervous energy. "My dear Miss Marple, how kind of you to come on such short notice." "It is I who should thank you," replied Miss Marple warmly, settling into a chintz-covered armchair. "One so rarely has the pleasure of seeing your lovely drawing-room." The conversation began in the usual village manner. Remarks about the lateness of spring, the difficulty of finding good help, and the perennial gossip of the Women's Institute. But Miss Marple, with her unfailing powers of observation, noticed a distinct strain underlying her hostess's composure. Soon, Colonel Faversham entered, a tall, broad-shouldered man whose once handsome features had been weathered by sun and service. His greeting was polite enough, though perfunctory, and he seemed far more occupied with pouring himself a stiff glass of sherry than with the niceties of tea. And then Margaret entered, a young woman of 25, with dark hair swept elegantly off her brow, and eyes that shone with lively intelligence. Her beauty was undeniable, though it carried the faint suggestion of wilfulness, as though she were accustomed to having her way in matters both small and great. "I'm so glad you came, Miss Marple," Margaret said, seating herself upon the sofa. Aunt Evelyn insisted we ought to invite you. She said you are the very best person for advice." Miss Marple inclined her head modestly. "Advice, my dear, I cannot think why my opinion should be of value." Colonel Faversham gave a short laugh, though there was little amusement in it. "Because you know everything that goes on in this village, Miss Marple, more than most people would care to admit." It was Evelyn who at last revealed the purpose of the invitation. "We are concerned, Miss Marple," she said, lowering her voice. "There have been peculiar occurrences in the house, objects misplaced, strange noises, and yesterday," she hesitated, glancing nervously at her husband, "yesterday, Margaret discovered something most alarming." Margaret reached into her handbag and produced an object wrapped in a silk handkerchief. She placed it upon the tea table, and when the cloth was drawn back, Miss Marple beheld a single knitting needle, slender and gleaming, its silver surface engraved with strange markings. Miss Marple leaned closer, her eyes narrowing. "How curious. I've never seen one quite like it." "It was found in the blue bedroom," Margaret explained. "No one in this house knits, Miss Marple. Not Aunt Evelyn, nor Uncle Arthur, nor myself, and yet it was lying upon the pillow, as though deliberately placed there." Colonel Faversham made an impatient sound. "It is all nonsense, Jane. Some servant must have left it." Evelyn, however, looked stricken. "But the servants deny it. And there is talk in the village already that the manor is cursed." At this Miss Marple's knitting fingers twitched, for she knew well how village gossip could weave a tale more intricate than any ball of yarn. "Cursed, you say?" she asked gently. "Yes," Margaret said, her eyes shining with excitement rather than fear. "They say the knitting needle belonged to Lady Agatha, the Colonel's great-aunt, who was found dead in this very house some 50 years ago. Her death was said to be mysterious." Miss Marple regarded the needle once more. "Mysterious deaths," she murmured, "are rarely as inexplicable as they appear. They generally arise from the oldest of causes, human frailty, pride, or greed." Her words hung in the air, and in that moment Miss Marple felt, with the unerring instinct of a lifetime's quiet observation, that the knitting needle was far from an idle curiosity. It was a herald of trouble yet to come. The inciting incident, the trouble, came sooner than anyone anticipated. That very evening, as twilight deepened across the lawns of the manor, a terrible cry rang out from the upper floor. Servants rushed upstairs to find Margaret collapsed upon the landing outside the blue bedroom. She had been pricked upon the hand, and beside her lay the silver knitting needle. Though the injury seemed trivial, Margaret was pale and trembling, whispering that she had felt an icy hand guiding the needle towards her flesh. Dr. Haydock, the village physician, was summoned at once. He pronounced the wound harmless, but warned that hysteria and shock could be more dangerous than any scratch. Margaret was carried to her room, where Evelyn kept vigil at her bedside. The Colonel scoffed at the entire affair, yet he looked uneasy when Miss Marple, who had lingered out of neighborly concern, asked whether the needle might have been tampered with. "You mean poisoned?" he demanded. "Why, Colonel," Miss Marple said softly, "it is always wise to consider every possibility, for one never knows what dark designs may be concealed beneath the ordinary." And thus, within the quiet walls of Faversham Manor, beneath the tranquil veneer of village life, a sinister mystery had begun to unravel, one that would draw Miss Marple into its tangled skein, where every thread concealed a secret, and where even a simple knitting needle might prove fatal. The events at Faversham Manor spread through St. Mary Mead with a swiftness that only village gossip could achieve. By the following morning, every household seemed to know that young Margaret Faversham had nearly been struck down by the cursed knitting needle. Some whispered of ancestral ghosts, others of hidden sins. A few, more practical sorts, suggested that Margaret had simply pricked herself and swooned in a fit of melodrama. Miss Marple, sitting once more in her parlour with her knitting, listened patiently as her maid Gladys relayed the latest, definitive accounts. "They do say, ma'am," Gladys insisted breathlessly, "that it was Lady Agatha's spirit what held the needle. Mrs. Price, Ridley swears it on her life, and Mrs. Bartlett says Margaret screamed out the very words, 'She's here! She's come for me!'" Miss Marple, her needles clicking softly, observed, "Mrs. Bartlett is an excellent churchwoman, Gladys, but I should not say she has the gift of accuracy. People very often hear what they expect to hear." Gladys looked disappointed. "Then you don't think it was a ghost, ma'am?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I have never yet found the supernatural necessary to explain human behavior, Gladys," though I daresay ghosts make a tidier explanation than greed or malice. Miss Marple at the manor again later that morning. Miss Marple walked to the manor under the pretext of inquiring after Margaret's health. The drive was damp from overnight rain, and the air smelled strongly of earth and hawthorn blossom. Inside, she was received by Evelyn Faversham, who looked pale and drawn from her vigil. "Margaret is resting," Evelyn explained, leading Miss Marple into the morning room. "Dear Haydock says it is only shock, but she is quite convinced that something unnatural was at work." Miss Marple seated herself, hands folded neatly upon her lap. Young people often have vivid imaginations. Still, it is curious how this knitting needle appears and reappears in the most inconvenient of places. Colonel Faversham entered at that moment, his jaw set in irritation. "I've had quite enough of this nonsense," he declared. "The girl is impressionable, that is all. This whole village thrives on superstition. I shall have the wretched thing locked away." "Indeed," said Miss Marple mildly, "but objects have a way of escaping the places they are locked in. Particularly when someone wishes them to." The Colonel gave her a sharp glance, but Evelyn's nervous glance at her husband suggested that argument was unwelcome. Enter the suspects. During her visit, Miss Marple contrived to encounter several members of the household and staff. She observed them keenly, noting every nuance of expression and tone of speech. Margaret Meg Faversham recovering in her room, her nerves shaken but her spirit not subdued. She told Miss Marple, in hushed tones, that she was certain the house harbored some dark secret. "It's as though the past won't let us alone," she insisted. Yet, beneath her fear, Miss Marple detected a certain relish. Margaret liked being at the center of a drama. Evelyn Faversham, kind and gentle, but clearly worn down by years of living with a brusque and domineering husband. She hovered about her niece with genuine concern, yet there was an edge of guilt in her manner, as though she feared she might somehow be to blame. Colonel Arthur Faversham, gruff, quick, tempered, dismissive of talk of curses. Yet he seemed particularly insistent that the knitting needle should be removed from sight. Miss Marple filed away this detail. When someone is too eager to dismiss an object, it is often because it troubles them more than they admit. Mr. Leonard Briggs, the Colonel's secretary, a thin, pale man of about 30, precise in speech and manner, he was polite to Miss Marple but overly cautious in answering questions. His eyes flicked nervously whenever the subject of family inheritance arose. Mrs. Simmons, the housekeeper, a solid woman of middle years, fiercely loyal to Mrs. Faversham, but less so to the Colonel. She hinted to Miss Marple that the young miss had enemies, though she refused to elaborate. Miss Marple reflected as she left the manor that each of these people, in their own way, seemed to stand in the shadow of that knitting needle. Gossip at the vicarage. That afternoon, Miss Marple took tea with the vicar's wife, Mrs. Griselda Clement, who was already brimming with the latest speculations. "It is all too delicious," Mrs. Clement said with a sparkle in her eye. "A family curse, an old murder, and now Margaret nearly struck down. My dear Jane, we are living in the very midst of a sensation novel." Miss Marple sipped her tea delicately. "The difficulty with sensation, Griselda, is that it so often distracts from the very ordinary motives that lie beneath. I wonder, for instance, whether anyone has considered the question of money." Mrs. Clement looked surprised. "Money? But the Favershams are well off, surely." "Appearances may deceive," Miss Marple said softly. "The manor is expensive to maintain. Colonel Faversham's pension cannot stretch far, and Margaret, as the Colonel's heiress, would prove quite useful to some people, either alive or dead." Mrs. Clement stared. "Jane! You don't mean—" "I mean only that it is wise to examine all possibilities." A quiet conversation with Dr. Haydock. Miss Marple next contrived to speak with Dr. Haydock, the village physician, who had attended Margaret. They met in the lane as he was making his rounds. Margaret's wound was nothing, Dr. Haydock assured her. A scratch, no more. But the girl is overwrought, and her aunt encourages her imagination. "And poison?" asked Miss Marple mildly. The doctor frowned. "There was no sign of it. Yet I cannot rule it out. A needle is an ideal weapon if one wished to deliver a minute quantity of something unpleasant. Difficult to detect too." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, very difficult indeed, especially if one wished the death to seem the work of a ghost." The doctor gave her a sharp glance. "Jane, you have that look in your eye. You suspect something." "I suspect human nature," Miss Marple said serenely. "And that is always worth suspecting." Threads begin to show in the following days. Miss Marple made her unobtrusive rounds of the village, quietly gathering scraps of information that others might dismiss as idle chatter. From Mrs. Bartlett at the High Street, she learned that Colonel Faversham had quarrelled recently with a solicitor over some legacy business. From the grocer's wife she heard that Margaret had been seen walking in the meadow with Leonard Briggs on several occasions, though the Colonel disapproved strongly. From Mrs. Price Ridley she gleaned that Evelyn Faversham had once been engaged to another man, before abruptly marrying the Colonel. Some broken heart there, mark my words, Mrs. Price Ridley declared. Each tidbit was duly knitted into Miss Marple's growing mental pattern. For she understood better than most that crimes were never born of curses or phantoms, but of jealousy, resentment, and the quiet desperation of those who felt cornered by life. Another disturbance. It was on the third evening, after Margaret's fainting spell, that another disturbance shook the household. The servants discovered the knitting needle once more, this time protruding from the seat cushion of Colonel Faversham's study chair. Had he sat upon it, the Colonel might have received more than a scratch. The Colonel was furious, roaring that it was the work of pranksters or fools. Evelyn burst into tears, declaring the house accursed. Margaret turned pale and clutched her aunt's hand, whispering that the spirit of Lady Agatha was hunting them one by one. Miss Marple, present by invitation, bent and examined the cushion closely. Her eyes, sharp and bright, missed nothing. The faint indentation of a hand pressing fabric, the peculiar angle of the needle's insertion. "How very curious," she murmured. "It is most unlike a ghost to be so practical, but it is precisely what one might expect from someone who wished to frighten, and perhaps harm, without leaving evidence." The Colonel scowled at her. "What are you implying, Miss Marple?" She looked up with innocent mildness. "Why, only that in my experience, Colonel, objects do not move of their own accord. They are moved by hands, unseen perhaps, but very human all the same." The closing of Act 2. Thus the stage was set. The cursed knitting needle had twice menaced the household, each time in a manner more deliberate than accidental. Whispers of ghosts and curses spread like ivy across the village, entwining truth with superstition. But Miss Marple, with her quiet knitting and her sharper than razor's mind, had already begun to follow the true thread, the thread of human motive. And as she walked home beneath the deepening twilight, she reflected that the most dangerous pattern in all human affairs is the one that hides in plain sight, woven from love, fear, and the desire for gain. For Miss Marple knew, though she did not yet say, that beneath the legend of Lady Agatha's ghost, a very real and very present evil was at work within the walls of Faversham Manor. The appearance of the knitting needle in Colonel Faversham's study chair unsettled the village far more than Margaret's fainting spell. It was one thing for a young woman to swoon at imagined ghosts, quite another for a respected colonel to be threatened in his own household. By the following day, speculation in St. Mary Mead had swelled into a veritable flood. At the grocer's, customers whispered of ancestral feuds. At the post office, Mrs. Hartnell declared with relish that the Favershams had brought the curse upon themselves. At the church, the vicar urged his flock to put aside superstition, though his wife confided to Miss Marple afterwards that she found the whole business most delicious. Miss Marple listened, observed, and knitted steadily, her pale blue eyes thoughtful. She knew that gossip, while exaggerated, often contained the seed of truth. One simply had to sift the chaff from the grain. A visit to Margaret's room, determined to observe Margaret more closely, Miss Marple paid another call to the manor. Evelyn received her kindly, and brought her up to Margaret's room, where the young lady reclined upon a chaise longue, pale but undeniably elegant. "My dear Miss Marple," Margaret exclaimed, "how good of you to visit. I cannot tell you how dreadful it has all been. Sometimes I feel as though the house itself is watching me." Miss Marple regarded her gently. "You mustn't let your imagination run away with you, my dear. Yet I cannot help but wonder who benefits most from your being in such distress." Margaret blinked at her, startled. "Why, no one, surely. Unless you mean Uncle Arthur. But he has no patience with me at the best of times. He thinks I am fanciful." "And young Mr. Briggs?" Miss Marple asked casually, her needles clicking softly. Margaret flushed. "Leonard? Oh, he has been nothing but kind. He listens when others scoff. He understands me, but Uncle despises him, and Aunt Evelyn says I must be careful. She fears there may be talk." Miss Marple tucked this away. A young woman with a forbidden admirer was a delicate matter, particularly when money, or inheritance, was at stake. Colonel Faversham loses his temper. As Miss Marple descended the staircase, she encountered the Colonel himself storming into the hall. His face was ruddy with irritation, his cane striking the tiles. "I will not have this house turned into a circus," he barked. "Every tradesman in the village seems to know our business. Cursed needles! Ghosts! I tell you, Miss Marple, it is all sheer tomorrot." "Indeed, Colonel," Miss Marple said mildly. "And yet the needle did appear in your chair. How do you suppose it came there?" He glared at her. "By some servant's carelessness or mischief, no doubt. I'll see to it that someone is dismissed for this folly." Miss Marple inclined her head, though she noted carefully how quick the Colonel was to deflect blame. Dismissing servants, she thought, was not the act of a man eager to uncover truth, but rather of one eager to bury it. Leonard Briggs confides. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple encountered Leonard Briggs outside the manor gates. He was walking briskly towards the village, his satchel under his arm, but he paused when he saw her. "Good day, Miss Marple," he said, his voice low and weary. "You seem troubled." "Mr. Briggs," she observed kindly. He gave a humorless laugh. "Who would not be? This house is full of tension. The Colonel shouts, Mrs. Faversham weeps, and poor Margaret trembles at every sound. It is intolerable." Miss Marple studied him. "You care for Margaret, do you not?" His eyes flickered, then hardened. "She deserves better than this. But I am only a secretary, Miss Marple. The Colonel would sooner see her dead than married to me." There was bitterness in his tone, sharp enough to wound. Miss Marple noted it silently. Bitterness, she knew, could be as dangerous as hatred. Evelyn's quiet sorrow, in contrast to Briggs's anger. Evelyn Faversham's sorrow was of a quieter kind. Miss Marple visited her the next morning, finding her in the garden tending a patch of pale roses. "They never quite bloom as they should," Evelyn said, straightening and brushing soil from her gloves. "Too much shade, perhaps, or perhaps the soil is poor." Her words seemed to Miss Marple a mirror of her life. A gentle woman, overshadowed by her husband, her spirit stifled. "You are very devoted to Margaret," Miss Marple remarked. "Yes," Evelyn said softly. "She is like the daughter I never had. I could not bear if anything were to happen to her." Miss Marple touched her arm. "You seem greatly burdened, my dear." Evelyn's eyes glistened. "Sometimes I wonder if the house has swallowed me whole. There are things one cannot speak of, Miss Marple, old secrets, long buried." Her voice trembled, but before Miss Marple could press further, Colonel Faversham's voice boomed across the lawn, summoning his wife. Evelyn straightened quickly, her sorrow shuttered once more. The red herring of Lady Agatha. It was inevitable that someone would unearth the story of Lady Agatha, the Colonel's great-aunt whose mysterious death, half a century earlier, had given rise to the legend of the cursed knitting needle. Mrs. Price, Ridley recounted it with relish over tea at the vicarage. She was found dead in her chamber, a knitting needle clutched in her hand, or so they say. Some whispered poison, others suicide. But the scandal was hushed up, for the family's sake. Miss Marple listened quietly. She knew well how stories altered with each retelling. Yet one fact stood out, the strange coincidence of a knitting needle in both Lady Agatha's death and Margaret's present peril. "But you mustn't think it a ghost, Jane," Mrs. Clement said hastily. "Surely you don't." "My dear," Miss Marple replied serenely, "I never discount human malice in favor of supernatural fancy. Ghosts may frighten, but they do not kill." A disturbing discovery. On the fourth evening after Margaret's fainting spell, another incident shook the household. Briggs, searching through the Colonel's desk for some papers, discovered a small vial tucked into a locked drawer. The vial contained a clear liquid, unlabeled. When confronted, the Colonel flew into a rage. "My private medicines! How dare you meddle in my affairs?" Briggs stammered an apology, but Miss Marple, who happened to be present, observed closely. She noted how the Colonel's hand shook slightly as he returned the vial to the drawer, how Evelyn turned pale and averted her eyes, how Margaret clutched her aunt's hand in alarm. Later, Miss Marple remarked softly to Evelyn, "It is most curious, is it not, how one so dismissive of danger should guard his medicine so fiercely?" Evelyn only whispered, "Please, Miss Marple, do not ask." Miss Marple reflects that night, seated by her window with her knitting, Miss Marple reflected on the tangled skein of the case. Margaret was in danger, whether from malice or her own imagination. Evelyn was weighed down by secrets, her sorrow a silent cry. The Colonel was a man with much to hide, his temper a mask for fear. Briggs was embittered, resentful, and dangerously devoted to Margaret. The knitting needle itself was no ghostly talisman, but a weapon, sharp, slender, and easy to disguise. The question was not whether it was dangerous, but whose hand wielded it. Miss Marple considered the possibilities. If Margaret were removed, the colonel might regain control of an inheritance. If the colonel were harmed, Evelyn might at last be free. If Evelyn were discredited, Margaret might be more easily influenced. And if Margaret lived but married Briggs, the colonel's plans might be thwarted. So many motives, so many possibilities. Yet Miss Marple, with her quiet certainty, knew that human wickedness was rarely as complicated as it seemed. People like her knitting patterns tended to repeat the same simple stitches: greed, jealousy, fear, over and over again. A false trail the next day. An astonishing rumor spread through the village. The housemaid claimed to have seen a figure in Lady Agatha's old room, a pale woman in a shawl, holding a knitting needle that glowed in the moonlight. The story caused a sensation. Crowds gathered near the manor gates, whispering of spectres. The colonel cursed the gibbering idiots and threatened to have the maid dismissed. But Miss Marple, upon speaking quietly to the girl, discovered that she had been roused from bed by a faint creak of floorboards. Peering into the hallway, she had glimpsed only a shadow and, in her half-dreaming state, embroidered the rest. "Dreams and shadows, my dear," Miss Marple told her gently. "They can deceive us all. But I daresay someone hoped they would deceive you in particular." Thus the mystery deepened. The knitting needle appeared not once but thrice. A vial of mysterious liquid was discovered. Whispers of Lady Agatha's ghost fanned the flames of fear, and every member of the household bore secrets. Some whispered, some shouted, but all dangerous. To the village, it was a tale of curses and spectres. To Miss Marple, it was the oldest tale of all, a struggle of human hearts, tangled in threads of love, resentment, and desire for power. But she also knew the climax was drawing near. The knitting needle would strike again, and when it did, the truth would be revealed. The weather turned unsettled as April wore on. A damp mist crept over St. Mary Mead, muffling the lanes and hedgerows. At the manor, the air seemed heavier still, charged with something that was not quite fear but close to it. A watchfulness, a waiting. Miss Marple had visited frequently in recent days, always with some mild excuse to bring a pot of jam, to inquire after Margaret's health, to lend Evelyn a book of devotional poetry. But each visit was part of her quiet inquiry, each glance and word carefully tucked into the growing tapestry of truth. The colonel's public collapse. The turning point came one evening when the colonel, attending a small dinner at the vicarage, suddenly grew pale, clutched his chest, and collapsed in his chair. Gasps erupted around the table. Mrs. Clement cried out. Dr. Haydock, fortunately present, hurried to his side. After a tense moment, the colonel revived, coughing and swearing. "Not fatal," the doctor murmured to Miss Marple as he bent over his patient. "Angina, perhaps, but I wonder." Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the water glass before the colonel. She noticed a faint residue upon the rim, almost crystalline in texture. Later she remarked softly to Dr. Haydock, "Poison rarely announces itself, but one must always look at what is left behind. A glass, a needle, a vial in a drawer." The doctor's eyes narrowed. "You think someone tried to kill him?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that someone wishes to make it appear so. Or perhaps both." Margaret's defiance meanwhile. Margaret seemed emboldened by the colonel's weakness. When Miss Marple next visited, she found the young woman standing in the garden with Leonard Briggs. Their heads were close, their tones earnest. As Miss Marple approached, Briggs bowed politely, though with evident discomfort. Margaret, however, raised her chin. "Miss Marple," she said with unusual boldness, "I am determined to leave this house. Uncle will never allow me happiness. He despises Leonard, but I will not be a prisoner of old quarrels." Miss Marple's gaze rested on her gently. "My dear, love is not always the simple refuge we imagine. It can bind as well as free, and sometimes," she paused, "it can blind us to danger." Margaret flushed. "You think me foolish." "Not foolish," Miss Marple said softly. "Merely very young, and youth is apt to mistake drama for destiny." Her words unsettled Margaret, though Briggs looked grim, as if already braced for battle with the colonel. Evelyn's secret. That same afternoon, Evelyn Faversham came quietly to Miss Marple's cottage. She looked pale, her eyes shadowed with sleeplessness. "I cannot bear it any longer," she said, sitting heavily in Miss Marple's parlour. "You are the only one I dare trust. There are things you must know." Miss Marple poured her tea and waited. Evelyn's hands trembled around the cup. The story of Lady Agatha's death was not what people believe. She did not die peacefully in her bed. She was found with a knitting needle driven into her chest. It was said she did it herself, that she was mad. But I do not believe it. Miss Marple's eyes were grave. "And what became of the needle?" It was hidden, I think. Arthur told me once, years ago, that the family wished it forgotten. But I fear it is the very same needle that now torments us." Miss Marple considered. "And your husband, does he know more than he admits?" Evelyn's voice dropped to a whisper. "Yes, he is terrified. But of what I do not know. There are papers he keeps locked away, letters from that time. He will not destroy them, yet he cannot bear to read them. Something in the past has him in its grip." Miss Marple's fingers stilled on her knitting. The pattern was beginning to show. Not a curse, not a ghost, but a buried crime that refused to stay hidden. The needle strikes again. The climax came on a stormy night. Rain lashed against the windows, and the wind moaned through the chimneys. The household had gathered in the drawing room, for the Colonel insisted that no one should be skulking about. While the storm raged, Margaret sat reading by the fire, Evelyn embroidered nervously, Briggs sorted papers, and the Colonel drank his brandy with habitual impatience. Miss Marple, who had been invited under the guise of neighborly company, sat knitting quietly. The atmosphere was tense, each person seemingly listening more to one another than to their own pursuits. Suddenly, a cry broke the silence. Margaret leapt from her chair, clutching her arm. Embedded in the upholstery where she had been sitting only a moment before was the silver knitting needle. The household erupted. Evelyn rushed to her niece. Briggs shouted. The Colonel swore violently. Miss Marple rose with deliberate calm and bent over the chair. She plucked the needle free with delicate precision, examining it under the lamplight. "Ah," she said softly. "So the needle moves once more. But this time I think it has revealed its master." All eyes turned to her, startled. Miss Marple gathers the threads. The next morning, Miss Marple requested that the household assemble in the drawing room. Evelyn, pale and anxious, Margaret, wide-eyed and trembling, Briggs, tight-lipped, and the Colonel, irritable and suspicious. Miss Marple, seated comfortably with her knitting, began in her mild, deliberate voice. "My dear friends, we have all been much troubled by this so-called cursed knitting needle. But I do not believe in curses. I believe only in human nature, and human nature, I fear, has been very much at work here." She paused, letting her eyes rest on each face in turn. "The question we must ask is who had reason to fear the past, and who had reason to use the needle as a weapon. For the truth is this: the death of Lady Agatha was no suicide, she was murdered, and the knitting needle was her killer." Gasps met her words. Evelyn pressed a hand to her lips. Margaret cried out. The Colonel barked, "Rubbish!" but his face was grey. Miss Marple continued, serene, "Someone in this house has revived that weapon, not to summon ghosts, but to silence the living." The appearance in Margaret's room, the near accident in the Colonel's study, the brandy glass at the vicarage, the chair last night, all point to a very human hand, and that hand belongs to— She broke off, her gaze steady. "But perhaps I should let the evidence speak for itself." A quiet interlude with the vicar, before confronting the household fully. Miss Marple took the precaution of consulting with the vicar in his study that evening. She explained her reasoning in simple, measured tones. "You see, Leonard Briggs wishes to protect Margaret, but he also has resentment enough to lash out. Evelyn wishes to shield her niece, but she carries guilt for a past she does not fully understand. The Colonel fears exposure of old sins more than any curse, and Margaret, poor child, delights in drama and danger without knowing how near death she truly comes." The vicar shook his head in amazement. "Jane, you astonish me. You speak of murder as though it were a pattern in your knitting." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "But it is, my dear. One learns to see where a stitch has been dropped, where the tension is uneven, and once you see the pattern, the design is plain." By now, Miss Marple had discerned the pattern. The knitting needle was not cursed, nor ghostly. It was wielded with intent, cold, practical, very human, and its wielder stood among the household still, confident that suspicion could be cast upon others. But Miss Marple, with her calm eyes and gentle voice, had traced each thread back to its source. The truth was clear to her now, though she had not yet spoken it aloud. The storm of revelation was about to break, and when it did, the quiet parlors of St. Mary Mead would echo with the unmasking of a murderer. The morning after the storm, the household of Faversham Manor gathered in the drawing-room, subdued and uneasy. The silver knitting needle lay on the table, glinting faintly in the watery light that filtered through the rain-streaked windows. Colonel Faversham sat rigid in his chair, his hands gripping the armrests as if he might crush them. Evelyn hovered by the fireplace, pale and trembling, while Margaret clung to Leonard Briggs's arm with anxious determination. Miss Marple, small and composed in her neat blue cardigan, looked entirely unruffled. She might have been presiding over a village sewing circle, rather than the climax of a dreadful mystery. "Miss Marple speaks. My dear friends," she began, her voice gentle but firm. "We have all suffered much confusion and fear over this matter of the cursed knitting needle. But I do not believe in curses, as you know. I believe in people, what they do, why they do it, and the little weaknesses they cannot hide." She glanced around the room, her knitting resting serenely in her lap. "Let us begin with the past. Lady Agatha did not die by her own hand. The knitting needle was thrust into her chest, and the truth was concealed by those who found her. Whether from fear of scandal, or loyalty, or simple cowardice, the story of suicide was invented." Evelyn gasped, pressing her hand to her lips. Colonel Faversham swore under his breath, but said nothing. Miss Marple went on. "But the past has a way of surfacing, and someone here has used that dreadful relic as a weapon once more, to frighten, to threaten, and even to kill." Margaret gave a little cry, and buried her face against Briggs's shoulder. The first attempt, the first appearance was in Margaret's room. Miss Marple continued. "The needle thrust into her pillow was not the work of a ghost, but of a hand that knew precisely how to terrify. And why? Because Margaret, in her innocence, was about to stumble upon the truth. Her growing closeness to Leonard Briggs, and her determination to defy her uncle, threatened to bring long, buried matters into the open. Someone sought to silence her, or at least to warn her." She looked kindly at Margaret, who shivered but raised her chin with youthful pride. The Colonel's collapse. The next incident was the Colonel's collapse at the vicarage. A small quantity of digitalis, or something akin to it, was added to his brandy. Not enough to kill, but enough to frighten, to weaken. A warning again, though one that could easily have tipped into murder. Colonel Faversham bristled. "I knew it! Someone is out to finish me off." Miss Marple gave him a mild glance. "Indeed, Colonel, but not for the reasons you imagine." The needle in the chair. And finally, Miss Marple said, the most dangerous attempt, the needle hidden in the chair, where poor Margaret sat. Had she not moved at the right moment, it might have pierced her heart, just as it did her great aunt so many years ago. The room fell silent, each person staring at the needle on the table as though it might leap up of its own accord. The culprit revealed. Miss Marple folded her hands over her knitting. Her eyes, bright and clear, moved from face to face until they rested on Evelyn Faversham. "It was you, my dear," she said gently. "It was you who placed the needle, you who laced the drink, you who carried out each attempt, not out of malice, but out of desperation." A collective gasp filled the room. Evelyn staggered back, her face drained of color. "No," Margaret cried. "Aunt Evelyn could never. She is the kindest soul alive." Evelyn sank into a chair, trembling. "I never meant. It was only to frighten, to make him see." "Oh, God forgive me." Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "You feared Margaret would follow in Lady Agatha's path, falling in love, defying the Colonel, and perhaps paying with her life. You remembered what truly happened to Lady Agatha, though you never dared speak it aloud. And when the Colonel grew crueler, when Leonard Briggs appeared and stirred old quarrels, you panicked. The needle was at hand, hidden away all these years. You thought to use it as a warning, a symbol of the past that would compel the Colonel to relent. But your warnings grew wild, your fear stronger than your judgment, and soon you found yourself in the role of executioner rather than protector." Evelyn's confession. Tears spilled down Evelyn's cheeks. "Yes," she whispered, "it is true. I found the needle years ago, hidden in the Colonel's desk. I knew then what he had done. He killed Agatha in a fit of rage, and the family hushed it up. I thought, if I frightened him with it, if I made him believe the past would return, he would lose his power over us. But it all went wrong. I nearly killed Margaret, my sweet girl. I never meant to harm her." Margaret knelt beside her aunt, grasping her hands. "Oh, Aunt Evelyn." The Colonel surged to his feet, his face purple. "Lies, slander! That woman's madness." Miss Marple raised a quiet hand. "No, Colonel. Not madness, truth. The letters you kept locked away, the papers Evelyn spoke of, they tell the story plainly enough. You killed your sister-in-law, and Evelyn, bound by fear and silence, has borne the guilt ever since." The Colonel blustered, then sagged heavily back into his chair. "She would have ruined us all," he muttered hoarsely. "She threatened to expose my dealings. I lost my temper, that's all. One moment of temper." Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her words were firm. "One moment of temper, Colonel. cost a woman her life and poisoned this household for decades, and now it has nearly claimed another. Justice, in Miss Marple's way. The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock. Evelyn sobbed quietly, Margaret clung to her, and Leonard Briggs stood grim-faced, his arm protectively around them both. At last Miss Marple spoke again, her tone gentle but resolute. The law may not reach all corners of this matter, but truth, once spoken, cannot be hidden again. The Colonel's guilt is plain. Evelyn's folly in seeking justice through fear has nearly destroyed her, but her heart was not wicked. She acted out of love, misguided, but love nonetheless. Dr. Haydock, who had joined them at Miss Marple's request, stepped forward. The Colonel's health is failing. He may not have long. Let him live out his days under the shadow of his crime. And as for Mrs. Faversham, well, the village need not know every detail, provided she is kept from further harm. Miss Marple nodded. Quite so. The knitting needle will be given into safe hands, destroyed, perhaps, so that no more may suffer from it. And Margaret, my dear, you must choose your path with care. Love is a fine thing, but it should not be built upon secrets and shadows. Be certain that what you seek with Mr. Briggs is true companionship, not mere escape. Margaret blushed, but she nodded earnestly. Epilogue. In the weeks that followed, the storm over Faversham Manor subsided. The Colonel grew weaker and more reclusive, his booming voice rarely heard beyond his study. Evelyn, though still frail, seemed lighter, relieved of a burden long carried. Margaret and Leonard Briggs walked together in the village with a new sense of calm, their quarrels with the Colonel no longer hanging over them like a sword. As for Miss Marple, she returned to her roses and her knitting with quiet satisfaction. She reflected, as she often did, that human nature was endlessly varied, endlessly predictable, and endlessly tragic. A curse, after all, was nothing more than a crime dressed in superstition. And yet, she thought as she wound a ball of soft grey wool, it was remarkable how often the smallest of objects, a scrap of paper, a teacup, or a knitting needle, could unravel the darkest of mysteries. Thus, the cursed knitting needle was laid to rest at last, not by fire or superstition, but by the quiet wisdom of a village spinster, who saw what others could not. That truth, like a dropped stitch, will always show itself in the end.